Thomas had spent most of his adult life believing that success would heal everything. If he worked harder, earned more money, climbed higher than everyone else, eventually he would feel complete. That was the dream that kept him awake through endless nights in the city. The dream that made him miss birthdays, ignore holidays, and slowly drift away from the woman who had once been the center of his entire world. And for a while, it worked. People respected him. His bosses admired him. His bank account grew larger every year. But something inside him kept growing emptier. The night everything finally broke felt strangely ordinary. Rain slid slowly down the glass walls of the office tower, while Chicago glowed below like a sea of cold lights. Thomas sat alone in his enormous office, staring at the congratulatory email still open on his laptop. Senior Executive Director, the title he had chased for almost 10 years. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt exhausted. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. His chest felt tight all the time now, like invisible hands were pressing against his ribs. He rubbed his face slowly and looked around the dark office floor. Every other employee had gone home hours ago. Only the cleaning crew remained. An old janitor pushed his cart quietly past Thomas's office, then paused after noticing the younger man still sitting there motionless in the dark. "Long night?" the old man asked gently. Thomas forced a tired smile. "Something like that." The janitor nodded toward the city skyline outside the window. "You know," he said softly, "a lot of people spend their whole lives climbing mountains." Thomas looked at him politely, unsure where the conversation was going. The old man smiled faintly, but sometimes they reached the top and realized they climbed the wrong one. Then he continued down the hallway. Thomas sat frozen long after the man disappeared, because deep down, he knew exactly what the old man meant. When Thomas finally got home close to midnight, the apartment was silent. The television flickered softly in the living room. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch under a blanket. 2 untouched plates of dinner sat cold on the coffee table. Thomas loosened his tie slowly. Another missed night, another broken promise. He was about to wake her when he noticed a folded note beside the plates. Thomas picked it up carefully. "I miss who we used to be." That was all. No anger, no accusations, no dramatic ultimatum, just sadness. And somehow that hurt more than yelling ever could. Thomas sat heavily in the dark, staring at Emma as she slept. There was a time she used to wait awake for him, a time they laughed constantly, a time they dreamed together. Now it felt like they were 2 strangers sharing the same apartment. For the first time in years, Thomas felt truly afraid. Not of failure, not of losing money, but of losing her. He barely slept that night. At sunrise, Emma walked quietly into the kitchen wearing one of his old sweaters. She stopped when she saw him still awake at the table. "You never came to bed?" she asked softly. Thomas shook his head. Neither spoke for several seconds. The silence between them wasn't angry anymore. It was tired. Thomas stared toward the pale morning light beyond the windows, then quietly said something Emma never expected. "I think I'm done." Emma frowned slightly. "With work?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "With this life." She looked at him carefully, unsure whether he was serious. Then Thomas reached into his pocket, pulled out his work phone, powered it off, and placed it in a drawer. For the first time in nearly a decade, 3 weeks later, they left the city behind. No celebration, no farewell party, just an old SUV filled with boxes and exhaustion. The long highway stretched endlessly through the desert, while mountains glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Emma rested her head against the passenger window, quietly watching the world change around them. For hours, neither spoke much, but strangely, the silence no longer felt cold. It felt fragile, like 2 wounded people trying to remember how to find each other again. Emma eventually smiled faintly. "Do you think we're making a mistake?" Thomas glanced at her. "Probably." She laughed softly for the first time in months. "But maybe being lost is better than being miserable." Thomas didn't answer, because he knew she was right. The sign for Willow Creek appeared just before sunset. "Welcome to Willow Creek. Population 203." The town looked frozen in time. Dusty roads, old wooden storefronts, pickup trucks parked outside diners, children riding bicycles down quiet streets. The air itself felt different there, slower, softer, like the world had forgotten how to rush. Their rental house sat near the edge of town beside an open field that stretched endlessly toward distant hills. It was small, old, and slightly worn down, but Emma smiled the moment she saw the porch swing. "I love it," she whispered. Thomas wished he could feel the same certainty. That first night, the silence unsettled him. No sirens, no traffic, no buzzing notifications, only wind moving through the trees outside. Thomas sat awake on the porch, long after Emma fell asleep inside. Without work surrounding him every second, his thoughts became impossible to escape. Who was he now? Back in the city, people needed him constantly. Employees called him. Executives depended on him. His calendar controlled every hour of his life. Here, nobody cared who he used to be, and that terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Over the next few weeks, Emma slowly began to change. She smiled more. She slept peacefully again. She planted flowers beside the porch and learned the names of neighbors. Sometimes Thomas would catch her laughing with people at the diner in town, and for brief moments, she looked like the woman he fell in love with years ago. Watching her heal should have made him happy. Instead, it filled him with quiet fear. Because while Emma seemed to be finding herself again, Thomas felt more lost every day. He spent hours applying for jobs online. Nothing worked. Most businesses in Willow Creek didn't care about corporate experience or executive leadership. One garage owner glanced over Thomas's resume and chuckled. "You managed 80 employees?" Thomas nodded awkwardly. The man handed the paper back. "Can you repair an engine?" Thomas hesitated. "No." The mechanic smiled kindly. "Then I don't know what to do with you." Thomas forced a laugh, but the embarrassment stayed with him all day. Later, while drinking coffee at the diner, he overheard two older men whispering nearby. "City boy won't last long out here." Thomas pretended not to hear, but their words followed him home. One afternoon, he drove past a large ranch outside town and noticed Emma near the fence talking to an older cowboy with gray hair and weathered hands. She was smiling, really smiling. Thomas slowed the truck instinctively. That evening, Emma explained over dinner. "His name is Walter Hayes," she said. "His daughter owns the bakery in town." Thomas nodded quietly. "She offered me a part-time job." "That's good," Thomas said, but his voice sounded distant even to himself. Emma studied him carefully. "You know," she said softly, "I haven't seen you smile like that in years." Thomas looked away immediately. Because she was right. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. He didn't know how to exist without ambition driving him every second. And without that constant pressure, he no longer knew who he was. Rain pounded against the roof later that night, while Thomas sat silently at the kitchen table. Emma washed dishes quietly. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Are you happier here without me?" "Emma Frotze." Thomas stared down at his hands. "You belong here," he continued bitterly. "People like you. You're healing." His voice lowered. "And I feel like I don't belong anywhere, anymore." Emma slowly turned toward him. Her expression softened instantly. "I don't need you to be successful, Thomas." He looked up. "I just want the man I fell in love with back." The words hit him harder than any insult ever could, because somewhere along the way, he had lost that man too. Unable to sleep, Thomas stepped outside close to midnight. Cold wind swept across the empty road, while distant thunder rolled beyond the hills. He sat heavily on the porch steps, staring into the darkness. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to admit something he had buried for far too long. He was scared. Scared Emma would eventually stop loving him. Scared he had wasted his entire life chasing things that didn't matter. Scared he no longer knew how to be happy. Then he heard a quiet sound near the fence. A sniffle. Thomas looked up. A small boy sat in the darkness, holding a trembling puppy, wrapped in an old blanket. The child couldn't have been older than 10. Thomas approached slowly. "You okay, kid?" The boy looked up with tearful eyes. "I think he's dying," he whispered. Thomas crouched beside him awkwardly. The puppy whimpered weakly. "Mr. the boy said quietly. "Do you know how to save something that's dying?" Thomas froze, because suddenly, The question didn't feel like it was only about the dog. Without another word, Thomas carefully picked up the puppy and carried it inside. Emma immediately rushed over. "Oh my God," the boy explained through shaky breaths that the puppy had been hit near the highway. Together, Thomas and Emma cleaned the animal's wounds at the kitchen table while rain continued falling outside. The puppy cried softly as Thomas wrapped its injured leg. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but because this was the first meaningful thing he had done in months that had absolutely nothing to do with work, money, or status. Emma noticed it too. For the first time since leaving the city, Thomas looked alive again. Hours later, after the puppy finally fell asleep wrapped in blankets, the boy sat quietly drinking hot chocolate. "My name's Eli," he said softly. "Thomas." Eli glanced around the small house. "You new here?" "Yeah." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "You running from something?" Thomas blinked in surprise. Emma almost smiled. Kids in small towns asked questions adults avoided. Thomas leaned back slowly. "Maybe." Eli stared into his cup for a moment. "My grandpa says people only come to Willow Creek for 2 reasons. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What reasons?" "To hide," Eli said quietly. "Or to heal." The room fell silent, because somehow the child had spoken the exact truth Thomas needed to hear. Later that night, after Eli's uncle picked him up, Emma stepped onto the porch beside Thomas. The storm had passed. Crickets echoed softly through the dark fields. Emma looked at him gently. "You smiled tonight." Thomas seemed confused. "When? When you were helping that puppy?" Thomas stared silently toward the horizon. Emma moved closer. "That's the man I remember." Thomas swallowed hard, because for the first time in years, he finally understood something important. Maybe success wasn't about climbing higher than everyone else. Maybe success looked more like this: a quiet house, a woman you loved beside you, and the strange peace of helping someone who truly needed you. The next morning, Thomas stepped outside carrying coffee and stopped in surprise. Eli sat on the porch steps smiling. The puppy rested happily in his lap. But that wasn't what shocked Thomas. The boy held out a folded note. "My grandpa wants to meet you," Eli said proudly. Thomas unfolded the paper slowly. His expression changed immediately. At the bottom were 6 handwritten words. "I think I have work for you." Thomas stared at the note while morning sunlight slowly spread across Willow Creek. And for the first time in a very long time, the future no longer looked empty.